I'm Jack Schwartz. Thanks for the introduction. I'll slip Fred a 10 for that. Anyway, almost 60 years ago, I started out working for what we then called a paper. Today, I'd be working for a screen, which doesn't have quite the same ring, and indeed, it is not the same thing. What happened in this other world is the burden of my book, the fine print, My Life as a Deskman, which I'm going to speak about. Shortly before I retired from the Times 10 years ago, I visited Antwerp, among whose treasures is the Plantin Moretus Museum. Can you all hear me? Okay. The oldest printing house in Europe. The building, which dates to the 16th century, houses its original print shop, containing a cornucopia of type in a dazzling array of styles, fonts, musical notes, and you name it. A tour of the premises takes a visitor through the various stages of the printing mechanism. The final stage of the process goes through the hand press, onto an inked and matte, and finally to the printed page. I noted that with the exception of the linotype machine, very little had changed between the 16th century and my own early days in journalism. A Renaissance printer would have recognized the rotary press, although mechanized, operated on the same principle as a hand press, only bigger and faster. I realized that between the invention of the printing press and the first half of my own career in hot type, not that much had altered. Then everything changed. What I'm going to discuss is what this other world was like before it completely fades away. What I will not talk about is celebrity journalists or the scoops of intrepid reporters or the politics of the venues where I worked. There's plenty of that without me. Instead, I'm going to try to recapture the world of print journalism before everything changed, the nitty-gritty of what actually went on in a newsroom. There were once 7 dailies in New York, as we mentioned. I worked for 5 of them: the Daily Mirror, the Post, Newsday, the Daily News, and the Times. Plus a little time at the Paris Herald Tribune on the side. So I've chosen a few vignettes adapted from my book that I hope will be illustrative of what this world was like. First, the Daily Mirror covers world events. If the general rule for the serious papers in their foreign report was to stress politics and downplay natural disasters, the Daily Mirror, the Hearst tabloid, where I started as a copy boy, reversed the process. A train wreck in Jakarta or a hotel fire in Singapore was something that Mirror readers could identify with. In effect, it treated the world as one great police blotter. Typical was the Mirror's coverage of a state visit to the UN in December 1957 by the Saudi monarch Ibn Saud. While the Times and the Trib were worrying themselves about the balance of power in the Middle East and the price of oil, the Mirror focused its energies on Ibn Saud's harem at the Waldorf. Under a headline that read, "You know about US girls? Well, harems scare 'em," the Mirror ran a story by one of our intrepid women staffers who putatively invested in harem life, investigated it. Should any female Mirror reader have illusions about an idyllic existence as odalisque to a pasha, our Nellie Bly debunked the myth of exotic harem life, warning instead that the reality was more akin to, quote, cell block A in the women's penitentiary, unquote. Accompanying the story was a prominently displayed photo of an Arab potentate, identified as Ibn Sam, glaring out at the reader. With a bushy black mustache, fiery dark eyes, a white keffiyeh somewhat askew, and an uncanny resemblance to Sam Susskind, the Mirror copy chief. Perhaps this was a near relative of the Saudi ruler, if not the king himself, in a caption that could have easily been misread by the Mirror audience as Ibn Saud. Now Susskind, a Brooklyn native, had what in those crustier times would have been considered a somewhat Semitic face. Presumably so did the king. Whatever he looked like, They would have been about the same age and shared a certain portly dignity. Moreover, Sam was a good company man, and he would do whatever was necessary to advance the paper's interests. Ever since then, Susskind was known as Ibn Sam, or, to the more literate, Susskind of Arabia. Years later, when I was city editor at Newsday, long after the Mirror's demise, I got a call from the publicity director of Nassau Community College, complaining about some malfeasance we had inflicted on the school. My secretary told me the PR man's name was Sam Susskind. I got on the phone and said deadpan, "Is this Ibn Sam?" End of complaint. The blackout. There's nothing like a crisis to test the mettle of a paper. My first such challenge was the Northeast blackout of 1965, when power was knocked out over New England, New York, New Jersey, and Long Island, the home turf of Newsday, where I was a night editor. I was on my way out to work from Manhattan, and my only thought was to get through the Midtown Tunnel and race out to our Garden City newsroom as quickly as possible. I arrived to an amazing sight. The city room was lit with tapers, like a church with typewriters. We had plenty of candle power, and the phone system had not been affected. So the three essential elements, light, phones, and typewriters, were all in place. The Dayside people virtually all volunteered to remain. Everybody wanted to be part of the action. By the time I got there, everything was well in place. Reporters had called in from all over, and we had them file from wherever they were. In Nassau County, our home base, we had the staff fan out to police headquarters, hospitals, schools, and neighborhoods. It was all very improvised, and I got involved in some of the New York coverage. We had a large contingent in the city, some of whom had been stranded, and we turned this to advantage. We sent reporters into high-rise buildings without elevator service, where people were either trying to climb up to their apartments or get down into the street. We were all over Con Edison on how the failure happened, with charts and power grids and maps of the areas affected. I took feeds from a disparate array of reporters and directed them to our rewrite bank. I also kept worrying that someone would knock over a candle and set the place on fire. The phones were literally jangling and the typewriters were clattering, but at the center of the storm, it was notably calm. For all the amorphous quality of the evening, it was a controlled chaos, harnessed to a single purpose: get the paper out. A news budget appeared, assignments focused, layouts materialized, consideration was given to the secondary news and the rest of the paper, which would still have to come out with this edition. Steadily, a mosaic began to take shape. It is hard to convey the heady, almost delirious quality of an all-hands effort like this. But the presses were knocked out, and unless electricity returned by early morning, we wouldn't be able to get the edition out on time. Yet for those of us in the newsroom and in the street, this seemed to be a mere technical problem. It was unthinkable that the paper wouldn't come out. By 2:30 a.m., the first edition was ready, copy in and edited, heads finished, layouts done. Page 1 signed off. All we needed was a little juice. Everyone huddled around candles, conjecturing, offering nervous banter, finding time at last for gallows humor. And then, a little after 3:30 a.m., the lights began flickering and gaining in strength, and they went on to stay. A great cheer went up. Everyone congratulated each other, hugging, shaking hands. The paper was a few minutes late the next morning, but no worse than it might have been after a normal production glitch. The trucks were rolling, and our readers got their papers as usual. The Paris Herald Tribune. The old Paris Trib headquarters at 21 Rue de Berry, off the Champs-Élysées, had a make-do quality, as if it were a stage set that would be removed during the day. Only at night did it come to life, but a fitful life of shadows, a gloomy brigadoon where the mist never lifts. There was a tentativeness about the office that reflected the transient lives of the editors it housed. As a group, they seemed to be the last of the itinerant journalists who moved from one paper to the next in that quixotic odyssey fueled by romance, restiveness, and rum. The only anchored bodies were the French printers, virtually all communists, who formed a permanent populace, stolid and disdainful, but indulgent to the transiting Yanks. It didn't matter how long the Americans had lived there or what their commitment was to the expatriate life. The Trib newsroom carried a whiff of the seedy bars that used to dot the Bowery, except that the denizens had upgraded the elixir of choice from Irish rotgut to French red. The ghosts of expatriates past hovered over the city room, smothering it with literary pretensions, evanescent as the smoke from the ubiquitous Gitane. The Paris expat model, for most, however, was not the outsized Hemingway, much less the austere Henry James, but Henry Miller, who offered a lifestyle that was improvident, anarchic, and ultimately unaccountable. Almost everyone affected to be writing a novel, or something that justified their inglorious toil as copy editors at the Trib. In those days, there was no reporting, simply cutting, splicing, reconfiguring what others had done, and then slapping on a headline. In late afternoon, the news editor, me, who had arrived an hour or two earlier, would cull the next day's news from the AP, the UPI, and Reuters wires, and distribute them to the various copy editors, who would transform them into a recombinant collage, with the breaking news updated periodically. This was done with scissors and paste pots, so that the copy desk looked like an adult version of a kindergarten table. Later in the evening, the wires of the New York Times and the Washington Post would subsume the earlier news services, and the drones in the Paris Trib office were simply facilitators, not so different from today's aggregators, who plucked and chose from the competing versions of the day's news now churning off the Times and Post wires. In effect, the editors at the 21 Rue de Berry were little more than a brain in a bottle, if you could call it that, while the arms and legs of the creature were elsewhere. If Paris was burning, let us say, the fire would be covered by the Times Bureau across town, relayed to the Home Office in New York, edited on its foreign desk, then sent out on the Times News Service wire, which hopefully would arrive in the Trib's office in Paris in time to be incorporated into the newspaper's second edition that closed at 11 p.m. or 5 p.m. New York time. On the other hand, this left the staff plenty of time for leisure pursuits, of which there were many. Naked came the stranger. Listen up. I applied for a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard in the spring of 1970. I never thought I'd get it, since Newsday's publisher, Captain Harry Guggenheim, had decided that such frippery gave Newsday little return on its investment and could indeed be counterproductive. Exhibit A was a Nieman Fellowship of my friend and predecessor, Mike McGrady, who spent his Nieman year at Harvard editing the Jacqueline Suzanne spoof Naked Came the Stranger. The novel's putative author, suburban housewife Penelope Ash, was actually 17 Newsday writers who had each been enjoined to compose an erotic chapter about a fictional Round Heels radio personality dubbed Gillian Blake, who embarked on a roundelay of sexual adventures with a host of Long Island men. All good writing was to be blue-penciled out, an unnecessary admonition. After the hoax was exposed, or rather self-exposed, the subsequent ballyhoo earned Newsday a week's worth of media fame in the dog days after Chappaquiddick. Harry Guggenheim was not amused, not least because he was parodied in a chapter about a local newspaper mogul called The Baron. The offensive section was written by his own editor-in-chief, Bill McElwain. I received the dubious distinction of Best Writing Award for my portrayal of Joshua Turnbull, a Long Island rabbi, as one of Gillian's admirers. What most of us saw as a bit of city room hijinks, the captain considered an act of unwanted notoriety that besmirched the paper's reputation. It was only through the intercession of cooler heads that he relented and allowed Newsday staffers to apply for Niemans, which is how I got to spend a year at Harvard. Arriving at the New York Times. I would imagine that most people who worked for the Times remembers their first day at the place, not so much what they covered or wrote, but the simple impression of being there. a special sense of having arrived. The illusion that everything else they'd done was simply throat clearing, rehearsal, preparation for the big time where they could show their mettle. I arrived at the Times in a series of ascensions. First, I came up out of the subway at the 42nd Street exit, just west of Broadway. At the time, it was the Great Blight Way, at its nadir before the gentrification of the 90s set in. The first thing that hit me was the smell of rancid orange juice from the papaya stand on the corner, mixed with the grease of sizzling meat and frying onions from a nearby souvlaki vendor. These vapors were tinctured with the funky odors of the various drugstore cowboys, white-booted ladies, and purple-hatted gents who owned the street. The local theatrical fair was a plethora of porn houses advertising their wares on a recessional of marquees along a street sprinkled with dirty bookstores. Around the corner was a carapace of the Allied Chemical Building, an ugly sarcophagus that entombed the structure of the original Times building. Presiding over all this was the Republic of China, a second-floor restaurant reached by a narrow stairway and advertised by a red and blue neon sign that flickered day and night in its windows, which looked down physically and socially on the agora below. By now, I'd reached 43rd Street, was inside of the Times building. A few stray rectangular rigged trucks parked outside the delivery bays, down the block on 8th Avenue, the digital clock hovering overhead, the flags more like bunting than banners, the revolving doors, and finally, I was in. Once inside the air-conditioned lobby, a sense of order and purpose reasserted itself. I took the elevator to the 8th floor, and there I was in the Sunday department. It was as calm and orderly as a hospital ward. Some chroniclers talk of the frenzy and chaos of first encountering the Times. For me, it was the opposite. I felt as if I were aboard the Queen Mary, after sailing on freighters and banana boats. Coming from a smaller vessel, one is struck by the tremendous infrastructure of the Times. At the paper of record, there's a net beneath the net. The world was there to accommodate you, and everything from the morgue to the library to the mailroom functioned serenely. I don't remember much of what I did that first week, but I do recall shutting off the lights in the office. The other departments by then had gone home, and only the Week in Review, where I worked, closed late. After I snapped the last switch, I paused in the darkened office to look out the window at the nightscape. Even the Hotel Carter, with its ugly facade and rough trade, seemed to glow as I essayed the possibilities of a new life. It was probably the last moment I was unreservedly happy at the Times. A footnote to the Pentagon Papers. The deputy culture editor in my day was Jerry Gold, a one-time assistant foreign editor who had virtually run the foreign desk during the Vietnam era. Gold, whose crusty ways and Brooklyn accent precluded him from ascending to the top tiers of management, possessed a steel-trap mind, prodigious analytic powers, and formidable organizational skills that put him front and center when the paper faced a ticklish problem. One such occasion was the Pentagon Papers. Although Neil Sheehan deservedly won credit for getting the story, Gold played an unsung but critical role. What the Times had on its hands in 1971 were thousands of pages of secret government study of the Vietnam War that it obtained from the Rand Corporation analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on the report. While the larger battle of publishing the papers was being fought in the Supreme Court, a different struggle was being waged to glean the nuggets from the sludge of undifferentiated Xerox pages that was going to make the story. Sifting through these massive files was a daunting task for Sheehan. Enter Gold. Amid the hue and cry, Jerry gathered up the boxes of documents and, hidden in plain sight, sequestered himself in a room at the Hilton. While Neil waded through the papers, Jerry burrowed through his copies, entrusting them to his safe at night. Together, Gold and Sheehan presented their findings to the editor-in-chief, Abe Rosenthal, and a battle plan emerged for publishing the report. When the Supreme Court ultimately supported the paper's right to publish the study in a landmark First Amendment decision, The Times was ready to go. Although others got the bylines, Jerry Gold's Herculean feat in initially siphoning the essence from the massive documents was a legend inside the paper, but unknown to the rest of the world. What appeared on the front page was often the tip of the iceberg, beneath which was an ensemble effort of myriad hidden talents. While the saga of the Pentagon Papers is often approached with reverence by awed posterity, it actually provided a plum assignment for the lucky staffers recruited to help Gold. 5 weeks at the Hilton, free. As Gold's task force grew, more reporters began showing up, taking additional rooms, all of them identifying themselves as Gerald Gold. For weeks, a series of Jerry Golds appeared to have amused hotel staff, prompting some of them to wonder if he weren't running a bordello, which in the Times Square precincts of that day would not have been a stretch. Finally, when the last article was finished, the real Gold emerged to settle up at the front desk. When the clerk asked him who he was, Jerry naturally replied, Gerald Gold, to which the clerk apocryphally replied, yeah, right. Finale. When I left the Times, there were no more printers, and the presses were rapidly becoming a thing of the past.
Jack, what year is this?
This would have been 2005. We had recently changed to a streamlined system that digitalized everything so that a single person at the keyboard could do the work of a dozen people. Backfield and copy editors, makeup editor, copy cutter, linotype operator, makeup man, lithographer, pressman, as well as a picture editor, paginator, and God knows what else to come. And even that was becoming obsolete, as was the whole idea of paper and print itself, which seemed to be going the way of the dodo. Presses giving way to platforms, copy to content, and the newspaper game to a recombinant journalism of online media, aggregation desks, and contributor networks, twittering, gawking, and buzzing into a digital future. I came to understand that while not fossilized, I was a living fossil, a creature that had undergone the geologic stages of all these momentous changes. The craft I entered was, in spirit, much closer to the era of Gutenberg than the age of Google, and I was there to see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Well, look, you know, it's easy to say, oh, you know, those are the good old days, and I don't go for that. Actually, there's been extraordinary change, which in many ways has made the papers better. And this is not just the Times. This is across the board. This is the LA Times, the Detroit Free Press, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Atlanta Constitution, and whatever else is left. So when I say that, I'm talking about virtually every paper that was once involved, you know, in print. The gain is probably one of speed, but the loss, and there are the graphics are amazing. We could never do the kind of graphics that they do, and just access to information. I think just as someone who actually worked there, I find that, you know, it was much more of a tactile game in which you were actually involved with people. So I was there, let's say, one of my many jobs was I was a night makeup editor at the time at a couple of places. So there you were, you're in a imagine this composing room, and there are like these chases that are sort of like this, containing a large forms of type. And there's a makeup man who's a printer, and these are real blue-collar guys, okay? And then there's the editor, usually myself, maybe 4 or 5 others, and they know what they're doing. You don't have to tell them what to do, but you can sort of help them along a little bit, okay? And so everyone is, you know, it was very kind of, there was very kind of personal engagement to it. And also you got to see a lot of people who you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So there I was with these blue-collar makeup guys. Which I had great respect for. They were artists. For instance, I don't know, well, okay, the mechanical thing. So someone writes a story, and in it, you know, it comes in these galleys, it's hot type. and you're standing there, and you're on deadline. There's no time to go back up and change anything. Okay, you're there, and so if you had to cut a story, you would try to cut. You would cut a paragraph in the middle of it. Literally, the printer would cut it with a razor, and then with a comma, he'd make a little period. You would try not always to cut from the end, because there might be a good kicker at the end. But the point is that this was a real art. It was a craft, and it was an amazing craft that, it's like glass blowing. You're not going to see it. On the other hand, the paper will come out it'll come out quicker, and it'll be cleaner. I used to come home, and I made the mistake of wearing a white suit on my first day with my wife, and I had, the New York Times, although I was in the composing room, and I literally, had a, ink, I literally had the first edition on my suit. Oh well, okay. So what you're saying is that are we teaching horseless carriage making in when Ford has invented the automobile? Is that, yeah? Look, you've raised a good problem, and I think that Columbia, where I taught, as a matter of fact, they do two things. Obviously, and I'm sure your communications majors certainly get that here. I'll try to talk to the microphone. The use of all of the communications modes and methods, dealing, how to deal with Facebook and using graphics and everything that involves technology. These young students are learning. They have to. Okay. We also, however, assume that there's a basic. There's basics of reporting, of interviewing, of trying to get at the truth, of getting your facts straight, which is and that won't change. So we sort of do a hybrid. I think that the technology is critical. You're lost without it, but there are also basics, and those basics will be true, and whether you're dealing with hot type, cold type, digital, or anything, and I think those basics are still critical for those of you who are in communications, and that's the important thing that your teachers should be instructing you on. You can always learn technology, but the other stuff is a little harder, and you've got to do both. But the getting your facts straight, getting it right, being fair, being balanced, that's important, and that won't go away. I'm sorry, the gentleman here, what's your name? Mentioned one of our co-authors, a guy named Bob Green, who was a terrific investigative reporter, by the way, and asked about how well the book sold. The book, actually, it was amazing. We were on the bestseller list, I think, for about 3 weeks, and we were on the David Frost show. What had happened was that basically a lot of people got wind of the fact that Penelope Ash was really a bunch of Newsday writers, and Mike McGrady kept sort of putting everybody off, the AP, the UPI, promising them all exclusives, and of course fibbing to everybody. And then the Wall Street Journal actually when they threatened to break the story, Mike gave it to the AP. It just happened that a few days before there was Chappaquiddick, which I guess some of you basically.
Some people may not know.
Okay, the short version is this: a woman named Mary Jo Kopechne was in early August was at a party with Ted Kennedy, and there was some drinking. They were driving, I guess, near some water pond in I think it was Martha's Vineyard, and the car went into the water. She drowned. There was a horrendous scandal involving Ted Kennedy, and I'm going to stop there. The point is this: the country was absolutely in a down. It was a very bad time, and it was the dog days of August. There was nothing in the paper, and in the middle of all this, up comes this story about Naked Came the Stranger, and everyone was just looking for a laugh. It was that simple. And so we went all over the country, and I think they sold something like 100,000 copies. I should tell you that we had a guy named Lyle Stewart, who was a bit of a buccaneer, And we were getting rights in, in Nicaragua, we had Italian rights. I was getting, $14.06, from Costa Rica about 10 years later. So yeah, the answer is that it did sell, and and Bob was, certainly one of. In fact, there's a very famous Picture in Life magazine where and Bob's sort of was one, a very talented guy. He as you may know, I'm sure you know better than I. He worked with Robert Cairo, who was also a Newsday guy, as an investigative reporter at Newsday before Cairo went on to write the Power Broker books. I think that objectivity is a myth. It never existed. You go back and look at any of the Pulitzer Prize-winning stories of the last 50 years. Haynes Johnson's reporting from Selma for the Washington Evening Star, Peter Arnett's reporting on Vietnam, John Hughes is reporting about the coup in Indonesia, Gene Miller's getting this guy who was actually on death row, saving his life after a Miami Herald, after a campaign of many years. My old colleague Brian Donovan at Newsday doing a story on the abuse of disability pensions by the police on Long Island. Point is that all of these had a point of view. The issue was not, and if you were on the other side of the firing line, you would have been outraged. If Bull Connors, in Selma would have been furious at the kind of coverage that Haynes Johnson reported. If you look at that story, Bull Connor is not getting his side. He's getting his side of the story, but he's not getting the side of the story that he wants. You could do a story about security problems, outside agitators, the fact that we're all very nice church-going people here, and why are you coming in and bothering us? I mean, there's a whole other way to write that story, but the important stories, the ones that got prizes, were all point of view. The issue was not to have a point of view. The issue was to get your facts right and make sure that you didn't get caught doing something that was unfair or that was just plain wrong. You did get the other side of the story, but then you were not obligated to give the flat earthers equal time with Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and NASA. They got their time, but they didn't have to get equal time. And you wrote a balanced, that's what got the prizes. All of these gored someone's ox. It was the purpose of journalism really so often was to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And as I say, the prizes are given for these kind of point of view. There isn't one Pulitzer Prize, a national reporting story, public service story that doesn't have a point of view and it's going to gore someone's ox. You just have to get your facts straight. I should make one other point. And this goes back like forever. John Peter Zenger, who maybe some of you heard of, the original libel case in New York back in colonial days, Governor Crosby would have Zenger, a printer, imprisoned for writing what he would say was a seditious article about him. And the defense by Andrew Hamilton was unique, that he was telling the truth. And until then, it didn't matter if you told the truth. If you insulted a public official, whether you told the truth or not, you went to prison. And this changed things. And I just want to give one other example, because this goes back at least more than in my memory. During the Spanish Civil War, the Times was known. Actually, we had as you know, there was a nationalist side which basically represented Franco and the fascists, and then there was the Republican side which represented the left. I'm just going to keep things simple. The Times solved the problem. There was a lot of controversy by sending two reporters. We had Herbert Matthews, who covered the story from the Republican side, and then we had a guy named William General Bill Carey, and he covered it from the nationalist side. So they were literally running these stories side by side. And in terms of a balance, Carey actually was broadcasting propaganda for Franco on Franco's radio during the war. He was getting his mail at the German embassy, and he was absolutely writing nationalist propaganda, and that was running side by side with Matthews' stuff. Carey, if he got an award from the Knights of Columbus for his distinguished journalism, and of course they wanted Matthews fired. My point being that here there was no attempt at objectivity, and I would like to again just to reiterate that if you go back and look at the best journalism that's been done in the last 60 years, all of it has a definite point of view, and the idea of which doesn't mean that you don't give the other side, but the idea of that journalists are objective automatons that don't have a point of view is just does not fit with or play with anything that's happened in the last 6 years, particularly the stuff that wins the prizes. At least that's my view of it. I think, and by the way, the new journalism, in a way, I think, in a way, did it a disservice, because the new journalism, the problem with the new journalism was that it melded fact and fiction, and it did a lot with as if writers were sort of, and people like Gates Lees, they were smart enough to sort of sometimes stay within the lines, but then a lot of people crossed over the line, and the result was that you really had fictionalized stuff, which was, to my mind, not journalism. I'll say something else. We had a guy at the time named Peter Keith, just one example. Peter was this has gotten through the 50s and 60s, a walking repository of New York City information. He just knew everything. He would, in the 60s and 70s, he'd interview the mayor about some scandal, and the TV people sort of listen in, and then Peter would sort of walk away. And then they would proceed to interview the mayor based on what they heard Peter talking about. Point is that I remember watching Peter, and they always say you learn a rabbi's Torah not by listening to what he's saying, but by watching how he ties a shoelace. And Peter was so meticulous about every single fact he got, checked, double-checked, and triple-checked before it got into the paper. Which doesn't mean that his stuff didn't have a point of view. It did. The beauty, but that was the opposite of a lot of new journalism stuff, which to my mind, I think, really crossed the line and mixed fact and fiction, which is just not, it's not good journalism. It gives newspapers a bad reputation, and it's not necessary. If you do your job, it's not necessary. No, well, there are two things. First, it's not completely true, because take a look at just one example, the Times investigation of Rikers Island. There was a great, and I could be here for a week, but I'm using that as a good example. There were tremendous abuses of prisoners at Rikers Island. And the Times, had a wonderful team that spent, a year or two doing this. And they, hopefully there may be some reforms. The problem, and I think you're right about this, there is less of it. Why is there less of it? Money. You mentioned Bob Greene, okay? So Bob Greene did a thing on the heroin trail in the 60s, in which he won a Pulitzer, by the way, with a team of newsday reporters. He spent over a year. I think he was in Afghanistan, Turkey, finally, in France, and of course, our streets here. And just imagine what this means. There are 5 people, okay? They're making salary to now. They okay, it looks like at least $500,000 a year, maybe less, but that's a tremendous effort for a newspaper to do. When papers were flushed and had money, they could do it. Obviously, papers have a lot less money now. They're losing money, you know. And until they figure out some balance between getting sufficient ads from digital digital readers and losing from paper readers, they're going to keep losing. Eventually, we hope they'll get it right, but it hasn't happened yet. Well, when you're losing, it's kind of, I think of I had a friend in the Chicago Tribune. They used to have 20 people covering the state capitol in Springfield. Now they have one. Now, stop to think about this. So you have someone covering economics, courts, the environment. They're all specialists in that. And, you know, if there's any hanky-panky going on, they're going to be on top of it. One person, he's like the AP, he's a wire service. You can't do it. Now, having said that, what I find is it's very refreshing that not just papers are still doing it, and they are, but you know, all kinds of wonderful digital things are going on, and as you may have noticed, more and more prizes, journalism prizes, are going to digital reporting. But in the end, you know, when you pull 4 or 5 people out of whether it's a digital service or a new paper, that's a tremendous investment in money. Just remember that. And to make that, you know, you do have to either you're going to cut corners, you're going to make sacrifices in some places, or else you won't be able to do it. The same thing with editing. You know, people, oh gee, I caught a typo, I caught this, I caught that in the Times. We used to have a copy desk of about a dozen people, and I mean that was a Metro desk, there was a culture desk. It's the same news hole. Okay, now maybe there are 6 or 8 people. They've cut staff. As you know, there are layoffs going on all the time. Well, they're just as smart as we were, and they're probably just as good as we were. But 6 people can't do the work of 12 people. It's that simple. So a lot of stuff is going to be getting through, not because anyone wants to say no. They can't do that, and so a lot of stuff now just gets out, and then you know we get corrections from readers and what have you. Mind you, I always felt it was just one of the things I used to do is I wrote the corrections for my desk, and which is a real kind of kabuki, because you had to mention the error. Oh, actually, you had to write the correction without mentioning the error, but it was the idea of just getting 1 million words out every day and getting most of it right. I always thought was a miracle. But I want you to know that whatever errors you'll see in any paper, again with the Atlanta Constitution, most of the time, you know, you've got very hardworking, diligent people. Sometimes they're overwhelmed. That's all. I know it happened in my case, but they do try. The news hole is the same, okay? But there are fewer people, and also not just few people doing it, but I think it was 24/7. And we had it, but there's a lot more. They're just more hurried. In other words, right now, I'm sure you've all heard of trending. This story is trending. That story is trending, and so they're trying to keep up. And when you have this, imagine this treadmill that's going faster and faster and faster. I couldn't, if it was me, as diligent as I was, and in fact, I think we had a terrific copy desk. At a certain point, when you've got all this trending going on and stuff go 24/7, stuff is going to get through. And you are right that you will see this, because it's not humanly possible to to do the kind of meticulous work that we were able to. And I don't want to. This is not, gee, we were better. We weren't better at all. These people are as good as we ever were. But I think that the technology and the nature and the demands and the idea of keeping up with the digital world and keeping up with all this other 24/7 news takes a toll and alters the state of journalism.
What do you do?
Well, let me ask, how many people here read a print newspaper? Okay. Now I know. Okay, I hope I'm not faulting anyone, but I noticed that of the hands raised, okay, with 1 or 2 exceptions, everyone was, probably, I've seen 50 come and go, and that's okay. So that already says something. That already says something. That I mean, this is a new world, and I don't expect you to alter your reading habits, but in fact that's sort of the point of my book, that we're in this new age, so but what I do is this: I still try to read a newspaper, but I also digitally I'll try to read the Washington Post, I'll try to read the Times, I will skim the Wall Street Journal, which I think has it's got a good news section, and then I will probably go into on the Real Clear Politics, which I think is and I
That's Real Clear Politics, people don't know, is considered one of the best aggregators of political news.
Yeah, exactly, and it's got a nice I feel variety of stuff that you might not see elsewhere. So those are probably the three things that I look at in the morning, just to get a sense of sort of what's going on. But I no longer consider myself, a news junkie. I just sort of want to be informed. But I think being informed is very important. Whatever you do, wherever you are in life, if you're an American citizen, if you care about the Republic, then reading a lot, reading what the other guy is doing too. It's very important to see how other people are thinking, and where they're coming from, and to have this kind of, we can't do it every day, but to have a spectrum, an omnibus sense of what's going on out there, is not just good for your soul, but I think it's important for you as a citizen.
Yes.
Well, no, you put your finger on it. This is, we used to have a saying, get it first, but get it right. And if you couldn't get it right, then you waited. We didn't have 20, but we had, let's say, 3 editions. So there was a Bulldog, the first edition, there was a second, there was a third, and then there was a late. And if a reporter couldn't justify his or her facts for the first edition, you held it, you sat on it, and you try to make it work for the second. And if that didn't work, then you sat on it until it worked. Because the worst thing for us was to go with it in the first edition, and then you're wrong. We wouldn't. It happened, but it happened rarely but you had to be willing to sit on a story, and you had to be willing to get beaten, and that was a risk you ran. But you're absolutely right. And the other thing, I'm sorry, this young guy you talk about, this is the global thing. The idea of, there was something called Global News Service, which I don't know if it's still in existence. So the guy from the Boston Herald, when he left the paper, tried to start it, and it was a very honorable thing where he got these young people, paid them very modest salaries, but they were very dedicated, and they had stuff from Afghanistan and China and Japan here and there and whatever, and problem was that they couldn't be paid enough. Some stayed, some didn't, but also they didn't have the infrastructure. Okay, just staff in Tokyo. There's, for that matter, Afghanistan's a better idea. So you have a reporter, then you have a fixer, then you have a driver, then you have a translator, then you have a staff. You're talking about not just a reporter, Carlotta Gall, or Jane Perlez. You're talking about an embassy. That's a lot of money, okay? And usually it's only the big institutions like the Journal, the Times, maybe the LA Times. Right now I think there are 4 papers in this country that still have major overseas bureaus. That's not good. You go back to even the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of, there were a lot of foreign correspondents, but they were correspondents who actually had institutions supporting them, and that meant that they could be there for 2 or 3 or 4 years. You don't get to know a country in 6 weeks. You parachute in, you parachute out. It takes years until people will trust you and talk to you. And that, as papers shrink, as their budgets shrink, as money shrinks, we're really losing a lot. And I'm sure anyone who can see it in terms of foreign coverage, which is so important. And one can only hope that this will be remedied, sometime down the pike. But you put your finger on it. No, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming here, and I hope this is of some efficacy, and you enjoyed the talk, and it was, I really very much enjoyed talking to you all, so thank you.
Yeah.